Another night, another unforgettable story. This is Mr. Geronimo. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. My name is Samuel Pierce. I am a ranger with the Appalachian Forest Service, and I have spent the last 27 years walking these mountains. I know these woods better than I know my own home. I know the seasons by the way the trees groan. I know danger by the way the animals fall silent. And I know something went deeply, fundamentally wrong on that July morning when 6 people arrived at the trailhead with camping gear and optimism. I should have turned them back at the gate. That was the first instinct that came to me when I saw them pulling into the lot at Blackthorn Ridge. 3 vehicles, mismatched equipment. The way Charles Harris stood there squinting at his phone, holding it up to the sky as if he could summon a signal from the Appalachian Ridge, told me immediately that these were not experienced hikers. Charles was 68 years old, with the kind of soft middle that comes from a life spent indoors. His shirt was too bright, his boots were too new. He had brought his wife Nancy, a woman of 47 who wore yoga pants to a mountain hike and smiled constantly, the kind of smile that comes from someone who has never experienced real discomfort. The others were Joseph Lewis, who was 50 and kept mentioning something about his blood pressure medication. Margaret Robinson, the oldest at 75, walked with a cane that she clearly did not intend to use, as if carrying it was only for show. Thomas Walker was the youngest at 32, with the kind of aggressive confidence that only comes from someone who has never been tested. And Donna Hall, 59, moved through the group like she was the organizer, the one responsible, the one who had bought the hiking guide from a bookstore and assumed that made her an expert. I watched them from my station above the parking area. Watched them pull on day packs, watched them consult the laminated trail map that Donna held up like a shield, watched them laugh at some joke, that high sound that carries too far through empty spaces. I came down from my post and met them at the trailhead marker. This was my job, part of my job, to provide information, to give warnings, to make sure people did not get lost in places they did not understand. Charles saw me coming and raised his hand. He had the look of someone about to ask me for directions to somewhere that was not a real place. I said, "My name is Samuel Pierce. I work for the Forest Service here." Charles smiled. He said, "Perfect. We are looking to do a moderate hike today, maybe a overnight camp. We are thinking about going out to Widow Holler and back. Donna has a trail map. We should be fine." I looked at the map in Donna's hands. Widow Holler. That was not a place I would have chosen for a group like this. Widow Holler was a valley cut deep between 2 ridges, and it had a particular reputation among the people who lived in the towns at the mountain's base. I did not believe in the stories people told. I did not believe in folklore, but I did believe in geography, in terrain, in the way certain valleys could trap sound and hold cold even in summer. I said, "You are experienced hikers?" Nancy answered before Charles could respond. She said, "We go on trips all the time. We did the Blue Ridge last year. This should be easy, right? It is summer. It is supposed to be beautiful." I looked at her shoes again. Designer hiking boots that had clearly never touched a trail, the way they gripped her feet too tightly. I thought about the 16 miles to Widow Holler and back. I thought about the elevation gain. I thought about what happens when people underestimate the mountains. I said, "The trail is not marked well near Widow Holler. There are some steep sections. The weather can change quickly." Joseph said, "The weather? It is beautiful right now." It was beautiful. It was a clear July morning. The kind of morning that makes you forget why you ever worry about anything. The sky was the color of old painted metal, a washed-out blue that seemed to stretch forever. There was no wind. There was no threat visible anywhere. The only thing that struck me, even then, was the birds. The birds were not singing. I could not hear a single bird call. In a healthy forest, even in the middle of July when the birds are less active than in spring, you hear something. You hear the small sounds, wrens, chickadees, the ambient noise of living things. But there was nothing. Just the sound of 6 people loading day packs and getting ready to walk into places they did not understand. I gave Charles a map. I showed him where the trail went, where the difficult sections were. I told him to stay together. I told him to turn back if the weather changed or if anyone felt tired. I wrote my ranger station number on a piece of paper and told him to call if anything went wrong. He put the number in his pocket without looking at it. They started up the trail at 9:15 in the morning. I watched them go. Watched Nancy talking too loudly about how the air felt fresh. Watched Margaret struggling a little with that cane. Watched Thomas setting an aggressive pace that the older people would have to match or fall behind. I remember thinking that I would probably see them again before the day was over. I remember thinking that Charles would have some problem, or Nancy would get blisters, or Margaret would decide she was too tired. I remember thinking that I was glad my shift ended at 5, so if they came back late, it would be someone else's problem. I went back to my station. I did paperwork. I took calls about a bear that had been seen near a residential area. I made notes about a fallen tree that blocked one of the access roads. I did the things I had done for 27 years, the routine tasks that made up my job. At 3:45, just as I was getting ready to leave, Thomas Walker came running down the trail. He was alone. He was running hard, the kind of running that comes from fear, not from physical exertion. His shirt was torn on one shoulder. There was something dark on his face that I realized was blood. He reached my station gasping, unable to speak. I grabbed him by the shoulders and asked him what had happened. Where were the others? What was wrong? He said something had gone wrong on the trail. He could not explain it. Something had happened to Nancy. Something had happened to the older woman. Something had been in the trees. I called for emergency services. I called for state police. I told Thomas to sit down and tell me everything he could remember. But what he told me did not make sense. He spoke about sounds. He spoke about the way the trail looked different. He spoke about coming around a bend and finding Nancy standing in the middle of the path, and she was not looking at them. She was looking up. He said that Charles had called her name and she had not responded, that she had just been standing there, neck bent back at an angle that looked wrong. He said that is when they heard the sound. He described it the way people always describe things they cannot fully understand. He said it was like a voice, but not a voice, like something imitating how a voice should sound, but getting it wrong. He said it came from above them, from somewhere in the canopy or the ridgeline. He said it was the worst sound he had ever heard, because it was almost familiar, like something from a dream you cannot quite remember. Margaret Robinson had not run. Margaret Robinson was still out there. Charles was still out there. Joseph Lewis was still out there. Donna Hall was still out there. And Nancy Clark was still out there too, according to Thomas, still standing in the middle of the trail, not responding to anyone, staring upward at something none of them could see. The rescue crews arrived by 4:30. We organized a search team. We went back out onto that trail with lights and radios and all the protocols we have trained for. We went looking for 4 people who were lost or hurt or in some kind of distress. We found the place where they had stopped. We found their day packs. We found a single hiking boot, the left one, Nancy's boot, lying on its side in the middle of the trail. We found Joseph Lewis. He was unconscious, suffering from a head injury. He was taken down the mountain by helicopter. But we did not find Charles. We did not find Margaret. We did not find Donna. We found the place where the trail forked, where they would have had to choose to go left or right, and the fork was not on any map. Neither of our maps showed a fork in that location, but it was there. A clear, worn path going to the left, down into terrain that was not on any of our surveys. A path that went into shadow and did not come back to the light. We searched until dark. We searched again the next morning. We brought in dogs. We brought in volunteers. We organized grid searches that covered every inch of that valley. We found no trace of Charles Harris. We found no trace of Margaret Robinson. We found no trace of Donna Hall. Nancy Clark was found by dogs on the 2nd day. She was sitting at the base of a massive oak tree about a quarter mile from the trail, in terrain that should have been impassable to someone who was not moving on their own. Her eyes were open. Her neck was still bent back at that angle that looked wrong, as if she was still looking up at something. She was alive, barely. She was alive, but she was not responsive. She was alive, but whatever was inside her head when the rescue crews found her was not Nancy Clark anymore. Joseph Lewis recovered. His memory of the events was fragmented. He spoke about sounds and confusion, and the way his perception of distance kept changing, how the trail seemed to stretch and compress like it was alive. But he was coherent. He was not like Nancy. Nancy Clark died 3 days after they found her. She never spoke again. She never looked at anyone. She never moved from that position of looking upward. And when she died, the hospital staff reported that in her final hour, the machines around her bed began to malfunction. The monitors showed readings that did not make sense. The devices that measured her heart, her breathing, her oxygen, all began to show impossible numbers. The nurses said they had never seen anything like it. They said that just before she died, she made a sound, a kind of vocalization. It did not sound human. It sounded like she was trying to imitate a voice, but getting it wrong. I never saw Charles Harris or Margaret Robinson or Donna Hall again. The official report said they were lost. The official report said they had wandered off trail and fallen into difficult terrain. The official report said that the group had made poor decisions and had not turned back when they should have. The official report did not mention the fork in the trail that was not on any map. The official report did not mention the sound that Thomas Walker described. The official report did not mention Nancy Clark's neck or the way she looked at something that none of us could see. I went back to the trail alone, 3 weeks after that morning in July. I went back in the daylight. I went back with my own equipment and my own knowledge of the mountains. I went back to find that fork in the path that was not on any map. I walked the trail for hours. I walked it very carefully. I did not deviate from the marked path. I did not look for the fork because I knew, by then, that some things only appear to certain people, that some paths only exist for those who are supposed to find them. But I did hear something, just once. As I was walking back toward my station, as the day was getting long and the shadows were getting thick, I heard it from somewhere up in the canopy, somewhere above me, somewhere far away and very close at the same time. It was like a voice. It was like something trying to imitate how a voice should sound, getting it wrong. It came from above. It came from everywhere. It came from inside my own head, and I understood then why Charles and Margaret and Donna had not come back. I understood why Nancy Clark could not look away. I understood why Joseph Lewis would never be quite the same. The day Hoot of the Appalachian Mountains is not a creature that hunts for food. It does not kill out of hunger or territorial instinct. It is something older than hunger. It is something that learns by taking, something that understands through imitation, something that calls from above, from the high places, from the ridges and the canopy, and asks a question that sounds almost like a voice, almost like a word, almost like it came from something that had once been human. And if you listen to it, if you let yourself hear it, if you let it teach you what it wants to know, then you do not come back down from these mountains. You just stand in the clearing and keep looking up. After that summer, I requested a transfer. I told my supervisor that I needed to work in a different region. I told him that I had been doing this job for too long and needed a change of scenery. I did not tell him the truth. I did not tell him that I was afraid to walk the trails alone anymore. I did not tell him that I had heard the sound again, several times, each time a little closer, each time a little more convincing. My transfer was approved. I moved to a different ranger station, 200 miles north, in a region of the mountains where the stories were different, where people spoke about other things. But the day Hoot does not care about ranger stations or administrative transfers. 2 years later, I received a call. It was from Sarah Chen, another ranger I had worked with at Blackthorn Ridge. She said that there had been another incident. A group had gone missing on the same trails. A group had heard the sound. She was calling me because I was the only other person who had experience with what was happening there, and she needed to know if the official story matched mine. I told her to meet me at a neutral location, a restaurant in a town that was about an hour from where either of us worked. We met on a Wednesday evening. Sarah looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had stopped sleeping. She ordered coffee and stared at it for a long time before she spoke. She said, "They are calling it a hiking accident. They are saying that the group got lost and separated and one of them fell. They are saying that the park is not responsible because the hikers were not following proper safety protocols. They are saying all of the official things." I asked her what she thought happened. She said, "I think something took them. I think there is something in those mountains that is more than just an animal or a person or anything that we have categories for. And I think it has been there for a long time, and it has learned to call in a way that sounds almost human, and people who hear it do not come back." I asked her about the details. She described the group, 3 adults and 2 teenagers on an overnight trip. They had set out on a different trail, one that was more remote, one that was even more poorly mapped than Widow Holler. Only one of the teenagers came back. The boy, Marcus, was 19 years old. He had come stumbling down the trail at 2 in the morning, soaking wet, even though there had been no rain. He had come down the trail repeating the same phrase over and over. He kept saying, "It sounds like my mom. It sounds like my mom. It sounds like my mom." His mother was among the missing, Sarah said. He heard her voice. He heard her calling from somewhere in the darkness. He said her voice was coming from above, from the ridgeline, from places where she could not possibly be. He said that the others wanted to follow the sound, wanted to climb up into the trees and the rocks where the sound was coming from. But he had run. He had been younger and faster, and he had run down the trail in the dark because something told him that if he did not run, he would stop running and start climbing instead. I asked Sarah if Marcus had heard any description from the others about what they were seeing, about what was making the sound. He said that one of the adults, the man who organized the trip, had looked up into the darkness and said that he could see a shape. He said it was big. He said it was in the trees. He said that it looked wrong, like something that should not have that shape, like something made of parts that did not fit together correctly. And then the man had stopped talking, and he had just started climbing. He had just started making his way up into the rocks toward the sound. I remember thinking, at that moment, that I needed to tell Sarah what I had learned. That I needed to tell her that the official protocols would not work here. That search teams would not find these people. That the day and the daylight meant nothing to this thing. That it had a name in the old stories because people had encountered it before, many times, over many years, and they had given it a name based on what it sounded like. The day Hoot. Not because it called in the day, but because its voice did not follow the normal rules of day or night, time or distance. But before I could say any of this, Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the number, and her face went very still. She said, "It is the state police. Something has happened. I have to go." She did not pay for her coffee. She did not finish her conversation with me. She just stood up and left the restaurant, and I sat there alone with 2 cold cups of coffee and the certainty that something worse was happening in the mountains. I should have called her back. I should have told her what I knew. I should have warned her about what was coming. Instead, I went home. I went home, and I did what I always did when the fear got too strong. I told myself that I was wrong. I told myself that I had misinterpreted the signs. I told myself that there was a rational explanation for everything that had happened, and that eventually someone would find the rational explanation, and everything would make sense. This is what I tell myself even now, even though I know that it is not true. Sarah Chen disappeared 3 days after our meeting. She had gone back to Blackthorn Ridge. She had gone back to that stretch of trail near Widow Holler. She had gone back alone, which violated every safety protocol, every piece of common sense. She had gone back because she had been hearing things. Other rangers reported that in the days before she disappeared, Sarah had been acting strangely. She had been distracted. She had been standing still for long periods of time, as if listening to something that no one else could hear. On the morning that she disappeared, she had told another ranger that she needed to check on something. She had said that she thought she had heard a voice coming from somewhere off trail. She said that she recognized the voice. She said that it sounded like someone she knew. She had been missing for 3 weeks when they found her. She was found in a place that was not on any map. She was found in a location that would have required her to leave the trail and navigate through terrain that was either impassable or impossible to navigate. She was found at the edge of a ravine that did not appear on any of the survey maps of that region. She was found sitting at the base of a tree that was much older than the surrounding forest. She was found in a posture of extreme reverence, her back against the trunk, her head tilted back, her eyes open and staring upward. She was not breathing when they found her. She had been dead for at least a week, and the coroner said that he could not determine a cause of death. There were no injuries. There were no signs of trauma. There were no signs of exposure, even though she had been outside for that long. It was as if her body had simply stopped functioning, as if something had been withdrawn from her, as if the fundamental thing that made her Sarah Chen had been removed. I went to her funeral. I stood in the back of the church, and I did not speak to anyone. I listened to people talk about what a dedicated worker she had been, how she had loved the mountains, how tragic it was that she had gotten lost. The official story was that she had suffered from depression. The official story was that she had taken her own life somewhere on the trail. The official story explained everything except the one thing that actually mattered. I was standing at the cemetery after the service when an old man approached me. He said his name was Harold Birch, and he had been a ranger in these mountains for 53 years before he retired. He said that he wanted to talk to me about Sarah. He said that he had known Sarah, and he had known about the incident at Blackthorn Ridge, and he knew that I had been there. I asked him how he could possibly know these things. He said, "Because this has happened before. It will happen again. The day Hoot does not go away. It is part of these mountains. It is part of the landscape like the rock and the water and the trees. And every few years, someone who does not understand what they are dealing with goes out into the wilderness, and they hear it, and they do not come back, or they come back wrong." I asked him if he had ever heard it. He said, "Once. A long time ago, before I understood what it was. I was young like you are now. I was hiking in a place that I should not have been hiking, and I heard it calling from somewhere above me, and for just a moment, I almost went toward the sound. For just a moment, I almost started climbing up into the darkness to find the source of the voice, he said, but I did not. I turned and ran, and I have spent the rest of my life being grateful for my speed and my good sense. And I have spent the rest of my life knowing that I will hear that sound again someday, and the next time I might not be fast enough. I asked him what caused it. What was it, really, this day Hoot that people spoke about? He said, I do not know. I have read a lot of old stories. I have talked to people from the Cherokee nations, the people who have lived in these mountains longer than anyone else. And the stories are old. They go back many generations, but the stories are not really stories. They are more like warnings. They are like pieces of information that have been passed down because people need to know about this thing. People need to know that there is something in the high places that is not like anything else. Something that learns by listening. Something that imitates what it hears. Something that feeds on understanding. I asked him what he meant, feeds on understanding. He said, it learns who we are by watching us die. That is what it does. That is what it is. It is something ancient that has been trying to understand human consciousness, trying to figure out what makes us different from other animals. And it does this by calling to us in a way that sounds almost human, and then watching what we do when we hear that sound. It is studying us. And every person who dies out there, every person who cannot resist the sound and follows it up into the darkness and does not come back down, they are being studied. They are being used to teach this thing what it needs to know. I did not believe him. I told him that this was folklore and superstition, and that there was no such thing as something that could survive for centuries in the wilderness studying human psychology. He said, believe what you want to believe, but keep a journal. Write down every strange thing that happens to you in the mountains. Write down every time you hear something that does not sound right. Write down every person you meet who seems to be listening to something that other people cannot hear. Keep the journal for 10 years, and then come back and talk to me if you still think I am wrong. He gave me his address. He gave me his phone number. He told me to contact him if I ever heard it again, if I ever felt the urge to follow the sound into the darkness, and then he left. I did not see him again after that day. I did not contact him. I did not write in the journal like he suggested. Instead, I did what I had learned to do. I denied. I rationalized. I told myself that there was no such thing as an ancient creature studying human consciousness through sound. I told myself that all of the deaths could be explained by misadventure and accident and the normal dangers of the wilderness. I told myself that I was an educated man working in the 21st century, and there was no room in my worldview for monsters. But the stories continued. Every year there was another incident. Sometimes it was serious, sometimes it was minor. Sometimes it was hikers who got lost and were found alive but confused. Sometimes it was people who disappeared and were never found. Sometimes it was people who were found dead with no apparent cause of death. The official reports always had explanations. The official reports always framed these incidents as separate, unrelated events, tragedies that had nothing to do with the mountain itself. But the rangers who worked in that region, the people who spent every day in the wilderness, they knew. They knew that something was connecting all of these incidents. They knew that the common denominator was not the weather or the terrain or the hikers themselves. The common denominator was a sound. The common denominator was a voice calling from the ridges and the canopy. The common denominator was something that asked a question that sounded almost human and waited to see who would answer. I transferred again. I moved to a ranger station 300 miles away, in a different mountain range entirely. I told myself that this would help. I told myself that distance would matter, that if I stayed away from Blackthorn Ridge and Widow Holler, I would be safe. But the day Hoot does not care about distance. 3 months after my transfer, I heard it. I was hiking alone, on a trail that was 15 miles from my new station. It was late afternoon. The light was turning golden. The air was warm. There was nothing about that moment that suggested anything was wrong. And then I heard it. From above. From somewhere in the trees. From somewhere high on the ridge above me. It sounded like a voice. It sounded like it was calling my name. It sounded almost like someone I knew. Someone I had loved a long time ago, before I became a ranger, before I came to the mountains. For just a moment, I stopped walking. For just a moment, I considered the option of looking up at the ridge. I considered the option of leaving the trail and climbing up into the trees to find the source of the voice. But I had heard the stories. I had read the patterns. I had seen the bodies. I had stood in cemeteries and listened to people talk about incidents they did not understand, so I did not look up. and I did not follow the sound. Instead, I started running. I have been running, in my own way, for 6 years. I no longer work as a ranger. I put in my resignation and I took a job working in an office in a small town, processing paperwork for the state environmental agency. It is not the work I wanted to do. It is not the work I loved. But it is work that keeps me indoors most of the time. Work that does not require me to spend my days in the mountains. Work that allows me to pretend that the wilderness is something that exists somewhere else, somewhere that I do not have to think about. But this is not a sustainable way to live. The fear is always there. Every sound that I cannot immediately identify causes a moment of panic. Every wind that sounds almost like a voice makes my heart race. I have not been able to sleep well in years. I wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, convinced that I can hear something calling my name from outside my window. I have tried to move on. I have tried to build a normal life. But the day Hoot does not let you move on. Last month, I was approached by a journalist. Her name was Lisa Martin, and she was researching missing persons cases in the Appalachian region. She had become curious about the patterns, just like I had. She had noticed that there were clusters of disappearances in certain areas, that the disappearances seemed to follow the ridgelines and the high valleys. She had connected me to several incidents through public records and through interviews with other rangers. She had figured out, through her research, that I had been present for or involved in multiple disappearances and multiple deaths that did not have clear explanations. She wanted to interview me on the record. I said no. I told her that I could not discuss ranger business. I told her that the incidents she was investigating were sensitive matters. I told her that there was nothing to see here, that she should stop looking into these cases and move on with her life. But Lisa Martin was a journalist, and she had been trained to recognize when someone was hiding the truth. She pushed me. She asked me directly if I believed that there was something in the mountains, something unknown, something that killed people, and I did something stupid. I told her that she should read the old stories. I told her that she should talk to the Cherokee elders. I told her that she should look up what the old name was for the thing that lived in the high places. I did not tell her the name directly. I did not say the words "Day Hoot" out loud, but I gave her enough information to find it. 3 weeks later, Lisa Martin went missing. She was on a research trip. She was interviewing people in a small town that was built at the base of a mountain. She told a hotel clerk that she was going to take a short hike to gather some background material for her article. She did not come back. The search teams found her a week later. They found her in a place that was miles away from where she said she was going to walk. They found her in a location that was off the map trails, in terrain that did not appear on any survey, near a ridgeline that did not officially exist. She was in the same posture as Nancy Clark. She was in the same posture as Sarah Chen. She was sitting with her back against a tree, her head tilted back, her eyes open, looking up at something that the search teams could not see. She had been dead for approximately 4 days. The coroner said that he could not determine a cause of death. The official report said that she had gotten lost. The official report said that she had suffered from exposure. The official report said that she had made a tragic mistake while hiking alone in terrain that was beyond her abilities. But I knew the truth. I had told her where to look. I had pointed her toward the Day Hoot. I had essentially murdered her through my own carelessness and my own desire to share the burden of knowing what I knew. After that, I made a decision. I am writing this account because I need someone else to know what happened. I need the record to exist somewhere outside of my own guilt and my own fear. I need someone to understand that the people who disappeared in the mountains did not disappear because of accidents or misadventure or poor judgment. They disappeared because something was calling them. Something was studying them. Something was learning what we are by watching us die. I have been thinking about what Harold Birch told me, what he said about keeping a journal. I have gone back through 6 years of my own life and tried to organize what I know. And what I know is this. The Day Hoot is not a local legend. It is not something that only exists in the Appalachian Mountains. There are similar stories from other places. There are similar disappearances from other wild places around the world. There are always wilderness areas where people go missing under circumstances that cannot be explained. There are always high places where search teams find bodies in locations that make no geographic sense. There are always creatures, always legends, always warnings passed down through generations. What if these are not separate phenomena? What if they are all the same thing, or related expressions of the same thing, working in different regions, learning from different human populations, trying to understand consciousness through death? I have also been thinking about what Harold Birch said when he asked me about what causes the Day Hoot. I have been thinking about his answer, something ancient that has been trying to understand human consciousness, something that learns by listening, something that feeds on understanding. What if he was right? What if this thing is not hunting us for food or territory, but for knowledge? What if everything that has happened, all the people who have died, all the people who have gone missing, all of this is part of a process of study and learning? If that is the case, then the disappearances will not stop. They will continue, because the day Hoot has not finished learning yet. It will keep calling from the ridges and the canopy. It will keep imitating our voices. It will keep learning how to sound more and more like someone we know, someone we love, someone whose voice will make us stop and listen instead of running. And every person who hears it and does not run, every person who climbs into the darkness to find the source of that voice, every person who does not come back, they are being used to teach this thing what it needs to know. I have not been back to the mountain since that day when I ran from the ridgeline, when I heard something calling my name, when I refused to follow the sound. I have spent 6 years in an office under fluorescent lights, and I have been grateful every single day that I did not look up, that I did not follow the voice, that I had enough sense to run. But lately, I have started to wonder if running was the right choice. I have started to wonder if I should have stayed and listened. I have started to wonder what would have happened if I had followed the sound up into the trees, into the darkness, into whatever it was that was imitating someone I knew. I have started to wonder if there is something I am supposed to understand, some knowledge that the day Hoot is trying to transfer to me through the sound of my own voice, through an imitation that is close enough to the original to make me listen. This is what scares me most. This is not fear of the mountains or fear of disappearing or fear of death. This is the fear that I understand the day Hoot's purpose. This is the fear that I have read the pattern correctly, that I have decoded the message, and that now I will not be able to stop thinking about what it means. I will not be able to stop hearing the echo of that voice calling my name from the ridgeline. I will not be able to stop wondering what would have happened if I had not run. I know what happens to people like me, people who know too much, people who have seen too much, people who have heard the sound and lived to tell about it. I know that sooner or later, I will hear it again. I know that sooner or later, I will stand on a trail or in a forest or in a place that seems safe, and I will hear it calling my name. And the next time, I might not run. The next time, I might listen. The next time, I might look up. The next time, I might find out what the day Hoot is trying to teach me. And the mountains will keep calling. The ridges will keep whispering. The darkness will keep waiting. And somewhere in the high places of the Appalachian Mountains, something ancient and patient will continue its study of human consciousness, learning a little more from every person who disappears, perfecting its imitation with every voice it imitates, waiting for the day when it understands us well enough to become one of us, or perhaps for the day when we understand it well enough to become one of it. I am writing this on a Thursday evening. The weather forecast for tomorrow says clear skies, no rain, perfect conditions for hiking. My shift at the office ends at 4 o'clock. There is a hiking trail about 15 miles from my house. It is a trail I have never walked before. It is a trail that I have been thinking about for 3 weeks now. I do not know why I have been thinking about this trail. I do not know why I have been researching the maps and reading the descriptions and looking at the photographs. I do not know why, whenever I close my eyes, I can hear something calling from far away, something that sounds almost like a voice, something that sounds almost familiar. I do not know if I will go hiking tomorrow. I do not know if I will take that trail. I do not know if I will listen to the sound that is calling from the ridgeline, if I hear it, or if I will have the strength to run again. I only know that one way or another, my running is almost over. The day Hoot is patient. It has been patient with Charles and Nancy and Margaret and Joseph and Donna. It has been patient with Sarah Chen. It has been patient with Lisa Martin and with everyone else who disappeared into the darkness of the mountains and did not come back. And now it is being patient with me. I can feel it. I can feel it in the way the evening air seems to carry a message. I can feel it in the way the sounds of the city seem distant and unreal, as if the real world is somewhere else, somewhere high and dark and dangerous. I can feel it in the way my thoughts keep returning to that trail, to those maps, to those photographs of a place I have never been. It is calling me. And this time I am not certain that I will have the strength to refuse. This is my account. This is everything that I know about the day Hoot and the mountains and the people who go missing in the high places. If you are reading this, then something has happened to me. Something has happened and I have not come back from the mountains, and someone has found this writing and decided to share it with the world. If you are reading this, and if you ever find yourself alone in the mountains, If you ever hear a sound that seems almost like a voice coming from the ridgeline or the canopy, if you ever hear something that sounds almost human calling out from the darkness, then do not stop, do not listen, do not look up, just run, because it is not done learning yet. It has not finished studying us, and every person who hears the sound and responds to it, every person who cannot resist the pull of that almost familiar voice, they are helping it understand us a little better. They are helping it learn what we are, and that is something that should remain unknown. I never expected that summer to change everything I understood about the wilderness I had protected for 20 years. My name is Christopher Allen, and I am a ranger for the National Park Service in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Before this season began, I thought I knew every secret these ancient rivers held. I was wrong. It started on a July morning when the heat settled over the valley like a living thing. The Appalachian rivers were running low from the drought, their banks exposed in ways I had never seen before. I was preparing for a routine inspection along the Northern Passage when I received a call from Sarah Young, the coordinator for outdoor recreation permits. 5 visitors had applied for a week-long hiking and camping expedition along the river valleys. This was not unusual. What made it unusual was that one of them was Daniel King. Daniel was 66 years old, retired military, and had a reputation for taking on challenges that most people half his age would refuse. His brother-in-law was Anthony Scott, 80 years old, a man who claimed he had hiked every major river system east of the Mississippi River. With them would be Lisa Wright, a wildlife photographer in her late 40s with a stubborn streak that reveled stone itself. Then there was Elizabeth Green, Anthony's sister, 71 years old, who according to the paperwork wanted to complete one final adventure before her health declined further. And then there was Sarah Young. At 34, she was their guide. She had hired me as a backup ranger, someone to check in on the group at designated points along their 7-day journey. She told me she thought it would be easy money. She told me she had walked these paths 100 times. She had never seen what lives in the deep mud where the Appalachian rivers twist through the ancient valleys. The group arrived on a Friday morning at Riverside Station, the main ranger outpost. I helped them organize their equipment, checked their permits, and reviewed the route they had planned. It was ambitious but not impossible. They would travel north along the river, camping at 3 designated sites, and return by the following Thursday. Sarah would stay with them throughout. I would meet them on day 3 at Confluence Point and again on day 5 at High Ridge. It seemed routine. "How long have you worked this sector?" Daniel asked me as we loaded the last of the supplies into their transport vehicle. 22 years, I said. "I know every inch of these rivers." He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Then you know what's out there." I remember feeling something cold move through my chest despite the oppressive heat. "What do you mean?" "Ask any of the old-timers," he said. "They'll tell you. The rivers keep their dead." I dismissed it as the kind of talk that experienced outdoor enthusiasts used to intimidate newcomers. It was folklore, the sort of thing that grew in the absence of understanding, that filled the gaps where science had not yet reached. I did not know then that folklore sometimes grows because something needs explaining. I did not know that some stories persist because what is being described is real. They left that morning in good spirits. Sarah waved from the lead position, confident in her abilities. The others followed, their backpacks heavy with supplies, their faces expectant with the prospect of adventure. I watched them disappear into the tree line along the northern trail, and then I returned to my station to monitor weather and maintain the communication radio. For the first 2 days, everything proceeded normally. Sarah called in each evening with brief check-in reports. Camp 1 was established without incident. Water levels were low as expected, but the weather held clear. The group was maintaining good pace. On the second night, Sarah's voice sounded slightly different when she reported their status, but I attributed this to radio quality and the ambient noise of their campsite. Day 3 arrived, and I prepared to hike to Confluence Point to meet them in person. The weather had shifted slightly. The sky held a peculiar shade of gray-green that I had learned, over many years, sometimes preceded unusual atmospheric conditions in the mountains. The air tasted different, metallic. There was no wind, and the insect sound seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The hike to Confluence Point took me 5 hours, and I arrived in late afternoon. The meeting point is a clearing where the North Fork of the Appalachian River widens slightly before entering a series of narrow gorges. To the west, beyond the clearing, the valley drops away into a ravine lined with dark water and exposed mud banks. That mud is different from the rest of the river. It is darker, denser, almost black in color. The locals have a name for that place. They call it the mud bottoms. I had never heard the name when I first started working in these mountains, but over 2 decades, the name had appeared more and more often in the stories old residents told in town. Hunters who would not enter that ravine. Fishermen who cast their lines from the far bank and refused to wade into that water. Native guides who would add hours to trips rather than pass directly through those spaces. I set up my camp at the designated site and waited. Sarah and her group should arrive by evening. As the sun descended toward the ridge, painting everything in shades of amber and deep crimson, I began to feel a presence in the landscape. This is difficult to explain to anyone who has not spent decades in the wilderness. The forest is never silent. There is always the movement of animals, the whisper of wind, the sound of water. But what I felt on that afternoon was different. It was like the forest was watching. Like something had become aware of my presence the moment I arrived. At dusk, I heard them coming through the trees, but something was wrong. Their pace was irregular. Voices called out to each other, not in the casual way of people who are tired but managing, but in tones that carried urgency. Sarah emerged from the tree line first, and even in the failing light, I could see that her face was pale. Her clothes were soaked, not with sweat, with water, with mud. "Christopher," she said, and her voice shook. "We need to talk about what we saw." The rest of the group emerged more slowly. Daniel King looked like he had aged 10 years in 2 days. Anthony Scott, despite his 80 years, had tears on his weathered face. Lisa Wright's hands trembled as she lowered her pack. Elizabeth Green moved as if she were in shock, placing one foot carefully in front of the other, like a woman who had forgotten how to walk and was relearning the process. Sarah sat down on a fallen log and buried her face in her hands for a long moment before she could speak. "On the second night," she began, "after we had made camp at the second site, Daniel went down to the river for water. He was only gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he was pale. He said he had seen something moving in the mud, something large. He did not want to talk about it. We thought perhaps he had seen a large fish or a beaver. But then, in the night, something made a sound." "What kind of sound?" I asked. "Like water moving," she said. "But underneath that, something else. Something like breathing. Something like—" She paused, and I saw her try several times to find the words. "Like something heavy dragging itself," Elizabeth finished. "That is what it sounded like to me. Something massive, pulling itself through the mud at the edge of our camp." I felt my professional skepticism begin to crack like ice, thinning under spring sun. "We did not sleep much," Sarah continued. "In the morning, Daniel insisted we continue moving. We would make better time if we pushed hard. We did, but when we reached the mud-bottom section of the valley, the very air changed." She looked at me directly. "You know that place? You know what the locals say about it?" I nodded slowly. "Folklore. Stories passed down." "These are not stories," Daniel King spoke up, his voice rough. "These are warnings. We should have listened to the warnings." They set up camp with me that night near Confluence Point. No one wanted to venture near the water's edge. When I tried to get more details, they would begin to answer, then stop, their eyes drifting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Only later, when Sarah and I stood alone while the others slept, did she tell me what had truly happened. On the second afternoon, as the group navigated through a narrower section of the river valley, the landscape had changed. The mud banks became higher, steeper, rising almost like walls on either side of the river. The water itself was different there, darker. The rocks were slick with something that was not quite mud and not quite water. When Lisa had slipped and caught herself against one of the rocks, the substance came away on her hands. It was warm, warmer than the water. Warmer than it had any right to be. That was when they first heard the sound, not the sound from the first night. This was different. This was a hollow, booming sound, like something striking the earth from beneath. It came from the far side of a bend in the river, hidden by an outcropping of ancient stone. Sarah wanted to continue forward, but Daniel, with his military experience, told them to stop, to wait, to observe. They waited for nearly an hour. The sound did not repeat. The landscape remained still. But the feeling of being observed, the sensation that something was aware of their presence, grew stronger with each passing minute. "Finally," Sarah told me in that quiet moment by the fire, "Daniel said we should try to see what had made the sound. He took Lisa with him. Anthony stayed with Elizabeth. I was supposed to stay with the packs, but I followed them. I could not help myself. I had to know." As they rounded the bend, the landscape opened into a wider clearing. This was the heart of the mud bottoms, the place that old stories seemed to circle but never describe in detail. The mud banks here were not just tall, they were enormous. They rose 30 feet or more above the water level, dark and shining as if they were wet. And they were not bare. There were marks on them, deep marks, gouges that looked like they had been clawed into the earth. There were also bones, not the small bones of fish or birds, large bones, the kind of bones that belonged to creatures much larger than anything that officially existed in the Appalachian region. The bones were ancient, Sarah said, but not so ancient that we could not identify what they were. Deer antlers, mountain lion skulls, what looked like black bear bones but larger than any bears that still exist. How large? I asked. Enormous, she whispered. Christopher, the skulls were the size of watermelons. The bones were as thick as timber. They had stood there, frozen, trying to process what they were seeing. And that was when the mud moved. It did not flow, Sarah said. It moved with purpose, like muscles contracting. The entire wall of mud on the far side of the river shifted inward, and something became visible. What did you see? I do not know how to describe it, Sarah said, and her voice dropped even lower. It was large, impossibly large. It had an outline, but the details were obscured by the mud. It was covered in it. But I could see what might have been eyes, multiple eyes, and a mouth. A mouth that was open so wide that the opening was nearly as tall as a person. She paused, and I could see her hands were shaking, and it made a sound. That hollow, booming sound we had heard before. But up close, it was not hollow at all. It was a voice. Christopher. It was using its voice. It sounded like hunger. It sounded like the earth itself had learned to speak, and all it knew how to say was one word, repeated again and again. What word? We ran, she said instead of answering. We ran back the way we came. The others were already moving. Anthony, despite his age, he moved faster than I have ever seen a person move. Daniel kept us together. We did not stop. We did not look back. And behind us, we could hear something moving through the water. Something that was large enough to make the river sound like a stream moving through a canyon. You do not need to continue, I told her. You need to know, she said. We need to know, because something has changed. All of us can feel it. The wilderness knows we saw it. And something was released in that moment. Something that was waiting for witnesses. I did not sleep well that night. By morning, Sarah and her group wanted to exit the park. I did not argue. I helped them prepare, and we began the hike back to Riverside Station. It took us most of the day, and I noticed that throughout the entire journey, no animals called, no birds sang. The forest was silent in a way that felt deliberate. What I did not tell them was that I had gone to the mud bottoms myself, briefly, after they had finished describing what they saw. I had needed to verify. I had found the bones exactly as Sarah described. I had found the claw marks in the mud banks, and I had found something else. In the soft mud near the water's edge, I found a track. Only one, but it was complete enough that I could see the shape of it. It was large, roughly 8 feet from heel to the end of the longest appendage. It had multiple toes, or fingers, or something in between, and it was recent. The mud was still settling into the outline. In the days after Sarah's group departed, I found myself unable to return to the normal routine of park management. I knew something had happened in those valleys. I also knew that no one would believe me. Park rangers do not file reports about creatures that contradict every law of biology and ecology. So I kept my knowledge to myself, which felt like keeping a secret that was slowly burning through me from inside. But I was not the only one who knew. Daniel King reached out to me a week after returning to civilization. He had done research, he said. He had found records, old newspaper articles from the 1800s and early 1900s about strange animal attacks in the Appalachian region, about livestock disappearing, about hunters and fishermen vanishing in the river valleys. And he had found a name that kept appearing in these old accounts, a name that was always dismissed, always attributed to folklore, to superstition, to the unreliable accounts of uneducated mountain people. The mud bottoms. Always the mud bottoms. There is a man in town, Daniel told me on the phone. His name is Marcus. He is 93 years old, and he still remembers when his grandfather told him stories about something that lived in the deep mud of the Appalachian rivers. His grandfather had heard the stories from his own grandfather. The stories go back more than 200 years. What do these stories say? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. That there is a creature, Daniel said slowly, that the earliest settlers in this region called the mud bottoms. Not because it lives in mud, but because it is made of mud. It is the earth taking shape. It is the valley itself becoming conscious. The stories say it sleeps most of the time, for years, decades, centuries perhaps. But when it wakes, it feeds. And once you have seen it, once it knows you have seen it, you are marked. Marked for what? That is what Marcus did not know, Daniel said. That is what the stories do not say. But he did give me a warning. He said that in 3 weeks, during the next full moon, things would change. He said that those who saw the creature would know the truth of that warning. I wanted to dismiss this as the paranoid thinking of an old man. I wanted to reassure myself that modern parks rangers did not deal with supernatural phenomena. But I could not stop thinking about the track I had found in the mud. And I could not stop thinking about the way the forest had been silent during our entire hike back. So I did something that I had never done in my career. I took 2 weeks of leave. I told my supervisor that I needed to attend to personal matters, and I spent those 2 weeks researching. I went to the local historical society and reviewed old newspapers. I found the articles that Daniel had mentioned. A settler named James Crawford reported in 1835 that something had killed his livestock and left massive tracks in the mud near his cabin. A hunting party in 1870 reported that they had heard a sound in the river valleys that no animal should be capable of producing. And they had seen something rise from the mud that was so large and so terrible that they had fled and refused to return to that part of the territory. In 1924, a young man named Robert Helms went missing in the mud bottoms. His body was never found. His friends reported that he had gone to gather water and had not returned. When they went to search for him, they found only his boots at the river's edge. Inside the boots, according to the account, was mud that was warm to the touch. The patterns were there, over 200 years of accounts. Most dismissed, most attributed to hoaxes or exaggeration. But the pattern was there, and it was consistent. Something lived in those waters, something that by its very nature defied logical explanation. I also found more recent accounts, hidden in articles about park accidents and hiking incidents. In 1988, a young woman named Patricia Voss had gone hiking in the Northern Valley alone. She had filed all the proper permits, she had told a friend where she was going. She never returned. The search party found her backpack at the river's edge, but no trace of Patricia herself, only a strange mark in the mud, something that looked almost like a handprint, but with far too many appendages. During the second week of my leave, I received another phone call. This time it was Elizabeth Green. Her voice was quiet and steady, but there was an undertone of something else, fear, perhaps, or knowledge that was too large to contain. "I have been dreaming," she said without preamble. "Every night since we left that place, I see the mud bottoms, I see the creature rising from the water, and I see myself, I see all of us. But something is wrong with the dreams. We are not where we should be." "What do you mean, not where we should be?" "The dreams take place at night," she said, "in the dark, but we can see clearly. And the mud bottoms is not in the river, it is in our homes, it is in our bedrooms, it is standing over our beds while we sleep." I wanted to tell her that these were stress-induced nightmares, the psychological aftermath of a traumatic experience. But I could not say these things, because I was having the same dreams. She continued. One dream was different. One dream was not about fear, it was about an invitation. The creature was showing me something. It was showing me why it let us go, why it did not simply kill us and drag us into the mud like it has killed so many others. "Why?" I asked, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "Because it wanted us to carry the message," Elizabeth said. "It wanted us to be witnesses who would speak of what we saw. It wanted us to tell others. It wants them to know it is here. It wants them to know it is waiting." "Waiting for what?" "I think," Elizabeth said slowly, "it is waiting for more people to come to those rivers. It is waiting for more hikers, more fishermen, more people seeking adventure in the wilderness, because each one that comes is a potential meal, and each one that sees it is another voice that will tell its story. And with each story, more people become curious, more people want to see the creature for themselves." "That would mean," I said, understanding the horrible logic of it, "that the creature is using us to bring it more victims." "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed. "The creature is not simply a killer. It is intelligent. It is patient. It has fed like this for over 200 years, maintaining a careful balance, killing enough to survive, keeping the attacks infrequent enough that they can be explained away. And now that we have seen it and lived, now that we are witnesses, it has a new tool. It has us." After the call ended, I sat in my house for a long time without moving. The weight of what Elizabeth had told me pressed down like the mud itself, heavy and suffocating. I had become a tool of the creature. My presence in that park, my knowledge of every trail and campsite and river crossing, made me an accessory to whatever the creature would do next. I thought about my responsibility. I thought about the oath I had taken as a ranger to protect the land and the people who came to experience it. And I realized that no official response was possible. Who would I tell? What evidence could I present? The bones at the mud bottoms could be attributed to natural predators, to hunting remnants from centuries past. The track in the mud could be a hoax, the historical accounts could be folklore, and the dreams could be dismissed as nightmares. The creature had chosen its hunting ground well, in a place where civilization was thin, where the wilderness still held power, where modern understanding had not yet penetrated to dispel all mystery. The creature was safe here, and we had all become complicit in its survival. By the time the full moon arrived, I had made my decision. I would document everything. I would compile all of the historical accounts, combine them with my professional observations, and I would create a record that could not be dismissed. I would ensure that even if the official channels ignored me, even if the Park Service dismissed my findings, the truth would exist. The truth would be preserved. But I was about to learn that the creature was not interested in allowing me to expose its nature. On the night of the full moon, I was called to a situation in the park. A hiking group had reported hearing strange sounds near the river. They were frightened. They wanted to leave immediately. By protocol, I should drive to their location and assess the situation. I was in my vehicle, on my way to meet them, when I saw him on the side of the road. It was Anthony Scott. But he should have been 300 miles away, in his home, safely removed from the park and the wilderness that had shown him such horror. He was walking toward the river, toward the darkness, and he was moving with a purposeful stride that was impossible for an 80-year-old man. I stopped the vehicle and called out to him. For a moment he did not respond. Then he turned and looked at me, and I realized that his eyes were not quite right. They were too bright, too aware, too filled with something that was not entirely Anthony anymore. "It is time," he said in a voice that did not quite sound like his own. "It wants you to understand. It is not just in the water. It is in us now. It has been since we left the mud bottoms. It is waiting to be born." The final revelation came not from Anthony, but from the thing that was wearing his skin like a suit. Because that is what I came to understand in those final days before the autumn equinox, when the boundary between seasons grows thin and the world shifts. The creature had not let Sarah's group go because it was merciful. It had let them go because it needed them. When beings of that magnitude, creatures that exist at the boundary between myth and reality, feed, they do not simply consume flesh and blood, they consume essence, they consume consciousness. And in the act of observing them, in the act of truly seeing them with human eyes that carry within them the weight of human meaning-making and pattern recognition, you become part of them. You become a vector for their will. The medical examinations revealed nothing. The doctors could not explain why Anthony's body temperature ran perpetually 10 degrees higher than normal. They could not explain the marks that appeared on his skin, marks that looked almost like writing in a language that predated human civilization. They could not explain the way he sometimes spoke in the voice of an 80-year-old man, and sometimes in tones that seemed to come from the earth itself. I tried to tell Daniel what I had discovered. I tried to explain the research I had compiled, the patterns I had identified, the horrible conclusion I had reached. But Daniel no longer wanted to listen. He had begun his own research, and his research had led him to a conclusion far more disturbing than anything I had imagined. "The creature is not new," he told me in a voice that trembled with suppressed understanding. "I have traced references to it back beyond the historical records. There are Native American accounts, records that were kept before European contact. The creature is not a natural predator. It is something much older than that. It is something that has existed in these mountains for thousands of years, perhaps much longer. It is not an animal that evolved. It is something that was called here, something that was bound to the earth and the water of this region through ritual and intention and purposes that we can no longer understand. Then it is something we cannot stop," I said. "No," Daniel agreed. "We cannot stop it, but perhaps we can understand what it is doing now. Perhaps we can predict what it will do next." What the creature would do next became apparent on the night of the autumn equinox. The park received 17 permits from hiking groups planning to venture into the northern valleys. 17 separate groups, all requesting access during the same week. The permit applications were normal in every way. They came from across the country. They appeared to be legitimate. But when I ran the names through records, I found something disturbing. 8 of the group leaders had, at some point in their lives, expressed interest in cryptozoology. 4 of them had written articles or blog posts about mysterious creatures encountered in remote areas. 3 of them had experienced their own close calls with unexplained phenomena in the wilderness. The applications were not random. The creature was calling to those whose consciousness had already been touched by its presence, even if they did not understand what they were being called toward. Lisa Wright called me 3 days before the equinox. Her voice sounded normal, but there was an undertone to it, something humming beneath the words like electricity beneath skin. "I have developed an infection," she told me. "That is what the doctors say. I have some kind of bacterial infection that antibiotics cannot treat. It started 3 days ago, right here, beneath my shoulder blade. The pain is significant. When I look in a mirror, there is a mark. It looks like a mouth. Christopher, it looks like something is trying to open itself inside my skin." I had no words to offer her. I drove to her house that evening, and when she opened the door, I could see the mark she had described. It was not a natural infection. The skin around it was not inflamed. Instead, it was darkening, becoming discolored, taking on a muddy brown hue that seemed almost to ripple beneath the surface, as if something beneath her skin was moving, exploring, becoming aware. "It whispers to me," Lisa said as I stared in horror. "Not words exactly, but intentions, desires, hunger. Christopher, it is showing me how much pain there is in the world, how much fear, how much darkness exists in the hearts of human beings. And it is telling me that this suffering is not meaningless. It is telling me that this suffering feeds something, that this suffering has a purpose." Sarah called from California, where she had fled hoping distance might offer protection. But distance meant nothing. The creature's reach was not measured in miles. It was measured in the fact that she had seen it. It had changed something in her, something fundamental to her consciousness. "I have stopped going outside during daylight," she told me, "because when I do, I can feel the creatures watching me, not just the one from the river. Other things, things that are not quite alive and not quite dead, things that are made of the same material as the mud bottoms itself. They have taken Sarah. The Sarah that existed before the mud bottoms is gone. What is left is something else. Something that is beginning to understand what it means to be in 2 places at once, to be both human and part of something much larger and much older." The night of the autumn equinox arrived with unusual weather. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of hours. The sky took on an unusual coloration, a greenish hue that seemed to emit its own faint light. And across the park, the 17 hiking groups converged, drawn together by something they did not consciously understand but could not resist. I made the decision that changed everything. I took the compiled research, the historical accounts, the evidence I had gathered, and I sent it to 3 independent researchers who specialized in folklore and cryptozoology. I uploaded it to a secure server. I left copies with a lawyer and with a friend outside the park system. I ensured that the truth, whatever truth could be extracted from the evidence, would survive beyond my own ability to maintain it. Then I drove to the mud bottoms, and I waited. The creature rose from the water on the night of the equinox, but it did not rise alone. There were others with it. Sarah, walking with a gait that was not entirely human, her movements synchronized with the water itself. Lisa, whose infection had spread across her entire body, leaving her skin a dappled brown and dark gray, beautiful and terrible at once. Anthony Scott, or what had been Anthony Scott, now transformed into something that was no longer distinguishable from the earth and water that had claimed him. And Elizabeth Green, moving with the grace of something that had learned human locomotion as a language, had studied it, and now spoke it with an accent that betrayed its foreign origin. There were others as well, the 17 hikers, transformed in ways that were unique to each. Some retained more human appearance than others. Some were almost entirely unrecognizable, having been absorbed so completely into the creature that they were now extensions of its will, its senses, its hunger. As I watched, they emerged from the water. They pulled themselves up the riverbank, and they began to move northward, toward the park entrance, toward the roads that led back to civilization. I did not try to stop them. What was I going to do? Call for backup? Explain what was happening? No one would believe me. No one could help. The transformation was complete. The gateway had been opened. The creature had found its vector, its method of entry, its way of spreading beyond the isolated valleys where it had hunted in solitude for so long. I realized in that moment what Elizabeth had meant in her dream. The creature was not using us to bring it victims. It was using us to become something new, to be born into a form that could exist in the human world, that could walk among people and not be immediately recognized as other. It was becoming human, or at least becoming human enough. It was learning to wear human skin like we wear clothes, and soon it would be indistinguishable from any other traveler, any other camper, any other explorer wandering into the lonely places where the old mysteries still held power. I wrote this account because I understand now that there is nothing else I can do. The creature is spreading. 3 months after the equinox, cases of unexplained infections began appearing in the southeastern United States. Young people, healthy people, reported strange marks appearing on their skin, symptoms that resembled no known disease, behavioral changes that their families could not explain, dreams that were shared between multiple people who had never met, whispers about mysterious locations, about needing to visit particular parks, particular river systems, particular wild places. The authorities will not find anything. They will search. They will investigate. They will find no evidence because the creature has learned how to hide within the variance of normal human behavior. It has learned how to spread itself across a population like a virus, like an idea, like a story that everyone feels compelled to tell. And perhaps that is the most terrifying aspect of all. Perhaps the creature never needed to feed on human flesh at all. Perhaps what it really hungered for was human consciousness, human storytelling, human myth-making. Perhaps by spreading this story, by telling what I have witnessed, I am doing exactly what the creature wants. I am giving it a new kind of immortality. I am ensuring that it will spread not through flesh, but through fear and fascination and the endless human compulsion to explore the boundaries between known and unknown. I have one final warning for anyone who reads this account, anyone who hears this story and feels the pull to seek out these places, to verify what I have told you. Do not go to the Appalachian rivers. Do not travel to the mud bottoms. Do not, under any circumstances, allow your eyes to perceive what waits in those depths. Because once you have seen it, once you have truly seen it, you become part of the story. You become part of something vast and ancient and hungry. You become a vector through which the oldest things in this world finally learn how to walk among us. The 17 hikers were never found. The official report attributed their disappearance to a hiking accident, to an unstable cliff face, to a tragedy in the wilderness. Search efforts were conducted. Nothing was recovered. The families grieved, and the story faded into the background noise of tragedy that plays continuously in the modern world. But I know where they are, I know what they have become, and I know that there are more of them every day. Somewhere in the human world, walking among us, learning our ways, studying our behavior, becoming ever more skilled at imitating us. The boundary between the mud bottoms and civilization has been breached. The creature that sleeps in the mud has learned to walk in daylight, and it is hungry for so much more than flesh. It hungers for the vast complexity of human consciousness. It hungers to know what it means to think like we think, to dream like we dream, to want things that have nothing to do with survival or appetite. It hungers to understand hope and despair and love and the particular kind of emptiness that exists in the human heart. I remain here, in my position as a park ranger, watching for signs, documenting what I see, trying to maintain the barrier between the wild places and the places where human civilization thrives. But I am only one person, and my time is limited. I can feel it now, the mark that being present that night has left upon me. I can feel the beginning of the transformation that will eventually make me into something new. Soon, I too will join the 17. Soon, I too will learn what it means to be unmade and remade in the image of something that exists in the spaces between mud and water, between life and death, between the ancient world and the modern world. And perhaps that is for the best. Perhaps understanding requires transformation. Perhaps the only way to truly know the creature is to become part of it. Perhaps I should stop resisting and accept what is coming for me. What has been coming for me since I found that track in the mud on a July afternoon in the Appalachian Mountains. My name is Christopher Allen, and I am no longer certain what I am. But I know this with certainty. The story I have told you is true. Every word is true. And by telling it, by reading it, by allowing yourself to believe in even the smallest possibility of its veracity, you have just taken the first step toward your own transformation. The mud bottoms wait for you now. They wait with infinite patience. They wait with hunger that cannot be satisfied by flesh alone. They wait with the oldest knowledge in these mountains, the knowledge that predates humanity, the knowledge that will outlast it. They are waiting, and they are watching, and they are becoming ever closer to the world you live in. Welcome to the story. You are part of it now. The report came to me on a Tuesday morning, filed by one of the volunteer rangers who covers the northern sector of the Appalachian waters. Missing persons, 2 groups. The exact circumstances remain unclear to this day, though I was the one who found what little evidence there was to find. My name is Michael Garrett. I have worked as a park ranger in these mountains for 19 years, and I have never witnessed anything that prepared me for what happened during that week in late August. I am writing this down now because those involved deserve to have their story told as it actually occurred, and because I need someone else to know that what I saw was real. The hiking party consisted of 6 people. Matthew Adams, who organized the trip, was 37 years old. He worked as an investment banker in Charlotte and had been coming to these mountains for 15 years. His knowledge of the terrain was extensive, though his judgment, as it turned out, was not always sound. Sandra Nelson was 62, a retired librarian from Raleigh who had hiked every major trail system in North Carolina. She was methodical, observant, and possessed the kind of patience that comes from decades of careful work. George Hill was 74. He was Matthew's uncle, a former construction foreman who had built 3 homes in the foothills and knew the old logging roads better than anyone I have ever met. The younger members of the group were Emily Baker, 33, who worked as a landscape architect and understood topography and water systems in ways that made her invaluable in wilderness settings. Stephen Rivera was 56 and worked as a materials manager for a textile company. He was quiet, competent, and someone who rarely complained even when conditions became difficult. Angela Campbell was 44 and worked as a freelance photographer. She had been documenting Appalachian landscapes for over a decade and had published work in several regional magazines. These were not inexperienced people playing at wilderness adventure. They were seasoned hikers preparing for what should have been a straightforward week-long journey along the ridge systems and through the valleys that border what the maps call Appalachian waters. The route they planned was well established, frequently traveled, and considered safe even for groups with mixed experience levels. They arrived at the upper trailhead near Roan Mountain on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of August. The weather was favorable. There were no unusual alerts. The forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures. By all conventional metrics, conditions were ideal for their intended itinerary. I did not meet the group until the following Wednesday, 4 days into their expedition. They were not lost or injured or in any immediate distress. Matthew had radioed in a routine situation report. They were making good progress, he said. The water levels were perfect. The wildlife viewing had been exceptional. Emily had photographed what she believed to be a bobcat family, which was unusual for the season. Everything was progressing according to schedule. His voice on the radio was different than I would have expected. It was not anxious, but it contained an undertone of something I could not immediately identify. Years of work in these mountains teaches you to listen to what people do not say. Their words are often less informative than the spaces between them. I should have acted on that instinct. I should have driven up to the ridge road that afternoon and positioned myself where I could monitor their movements. Instead, I filed the report and went about my other duties. This decision will remain with me for the rest of my life. It was not until late Thursday evening that things became difficult. Sandra Nelson activated her personal emergency beacon. The signal was weak and intermittent. This was immediately concerning because the group had been in constant contact with the ranger station, and there had been no indication of problems serious enough to warrant a beacon activation. I was on duty when the signal came through. My supervisor directed me to proceed to the location immediately. The coordinates placed them in a ravine approximately 6 miles east of their planned route. This was strange. The ravine was not on any of the trails they had mapped out. According to their itinerary, they should have been on the western ridge system, nowhere near that location. I reached the ravine at approximately 10 o'clock that night. I was not alone. The forest rangers from 3 counties had been mobilized, and a volunteer rescue team was coordinating with the state police. The scene at the ravine was one of controlled chaos. Lights swept across the rocky outcroppings. Voices called out through the darkness. The water below was moving fast and loud, a sound that seemed to fill the entire valley. What I found when I arrived has taken me 7 years to begin to process, and I am still not certain how to describe it in a way that will sound credible to anyone who was not there. The camp was empty, not abandoned, empty. There were 6 sleeping bags arranged in a careful semicircle. There were cooking equipment and food stores. There were day packs and water bottles. Everything was in order, arranged exactly as it would be if 6 people had simply decided to vanish from their beds in the middle of the night. What disturbed me most was the final item. Near the edge of the camp, partially hidden by a configuration of boulders, was Angela Campbell's camera. I found this detail significant because Angela was not the type to separate from her equipment. She carried that camera the way some people carry prayer beads. To find it abandoned, unfinished film still inside suggested that whatever had happened had been sudden and compelling enough to overcome every instinct of self-preservation. The rescue team's initial theory was that someone had become injured, disoriented others had gone in search of help, and they had become separated in the darkness. It was a reasonable hypothesis. It was also, as it turned out, incorrect. The search continued through the night and into Friday morning. Canine teams were brought in from the state police. Helicopters swept the ridgelines with thermal imaging. Volunteers on foot covered every accessible inch of terrain within a 5-mile radius of the ravine camp. By noon on Friday, we had found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no evidence of struggle or injury. It was as if 6 people had walked into the forest and ceased to exist. I spent Friday night awake in that ravine, sitting beside the abandoned camp, looking at Angela Campbell's camera and trying to construct a narrative that fit the facts we had been given. I was not alone. 2 state police officers and the rescue team coordinator were establishing a more formal search base. We were waiting for daylight so we could expand the radius of our search. What I did not know as I sat there in the gloom was that Matthew Adams had managed to reach a location 6 miles downstream. He would not arrive at the ranger station until Saturday morning, and what he told us would make no sense at all. Matthew Adams appeared at the ranger station at 6:45 on Saturday morning. The ranger on duty said he emerged from the tree line on the road leading to the station, walking unsteady but upright, wearing clothes that were torn and mud-stained but not wet. This detail was crucial because the ravine where his camp had been established was located above a series of water cascades that dropped more than 200 feet before settling into a valley stream. To reach the ranger station from that ravine without crossing water was theoretically impossible. I saw Matthew for the first time when I arrived at the station after receiving the call. He was wrapped in an emergency blanket, drinking coffee with shaking hands. His feet were severely blistered. His face was marked by scratches and what appeared to be severe dehydration. He did not appear to recognize me immediately, though we had been in communication by radio for the entire duration of his group's expedition. The state police officers began their questioning almost immediately. Matthew's account was fragmented and difficult to follow. His words were often disconnected from one another, as if he was translating his thoughts from a language for which English held no proper vocabulary. He told us that they had noticed something on Thursday afternoon. All 6 of them, not just him. A sound in the forest that was consistent and rhythmic but not mechanical. Not animal, he insisted. Not anything that fit into categories they could describe. It began at the edges of the camp. A sound like breathing, he said. A sound like something massive drawing air into lungs that were not designed for air. The description was contradictory and illogical, yet he maintained it with an intensity that suggested he was not lying, merely struggling with the inadequacy of human language. The sound continued through the afternoon and into the early evening. Matthew said that George Hill had attempted to locate its source. He had walked approximately 300 yards from the camp, following the sound through increasingly dense forest. He had returned 30 minutes later without having found anything, but visibly shaken. He would not explain to the others what he had seen or heard. He merely insisted that they remain in the camp, that they not wander from the established perimeter. Sandra Nelson, according to Matthew, had suggested that the sound might be water moving through underground caverns, a phenomenon that was not uncommon in the limestone formations that underlaid the region. Emily Baker had agreed. It was a reasonable explanation, Matthew said. They had accepted it. They had eaten dinner, they had prepared for sleep, and then, in the hours after darkness had fully settled, something else had occurred. Matthew's description of this event was where his account became nearly unintelligible. He spoke of what he called a presence, not a creature, though it had physical form, not a person, though it moved with intent and intelligence. It was, he said, a thing that did not belong in the categories by which the world was organized. This was when I first heard the word that would haunt me for years afterward, Fangmalia. Matthew did not know how he knew this name. He could not explain why this particular combination of sounds held meaning in relation to what they had experienced. He simply stated that this was what it was called, as if the name had been imprinted on his consciousness by some means he could not articulate. The state police officers exchanged glances. They did not believe him. I could see it in their expressions. They were beginning to construct a different narrative. Mass hallucination, perhaps, triggered by some environmental toxin, shared psychosis brought on by isolation and stress. These were the explanations forming in their minds. But I was listening to something that the officers were missing. Matthew was not describing a hallucination. He was describing memory. His words had the quality of someone retrieving actual events, not confabulating fiction. The fear in his voice was not the fear of someone who had experienced a psychological break. It was the fear of someone who had encountered something that his mind could barely process. He told us that the presence had begun to circle the camp. Slowly, deliberately, not attacking, but surrounding. Not making threats, but establishing something he could only describe as pressure. A pressure that was physical, psychological, and something else that he had no words for. Angela Campbell had tried to use her camera to document the presence. Matthew said she had positioned herself at the edge of the camp and attempted to photograph it. He described a shape that was suggested rather than defined, an absence in the darkness that moved with more coordination than any animal should possess. The camera's flash had activated once, then the camera had simply ceased to function. Angela had stood there holding equipment that would not work, and in the moment that she stood there defenseless, the presence had moved toward her. This was when the group had scattered. Matthew did not use that word. He said they had fled. He said they had run in different directions, away from the camp, away from the presence, away from one another. He said he did not remember making a conscious decision to run. He said he simply found himself moving through the forest in darkness with no clear sense of direction or purpose. He ran, he said, until his lungs burned and his legs refused to function. He ran until he collapsed against a fallen log and remained there for what felt like hours. He ran until the forest around him became so complete and so absolute that the possibility of the presence seemed less threatening than the certainty of dying alone in the gloom. And then, as dawn began to approach, he had found himself at a location he did not recognize, a valley he had never seen on any map. A place where the water was still and clear and seemed to reflect things that were not actually present in the sky above it. This was when he found the tracks. Matthew described them in a voice so quiet that the officers had to ask him to repeat himself. Tracks in the mud along the water's edge. Large tracks, not human, not any recognized animal. The prints were large enough that Matthew could fit his entire hand inside them, with fingers extended, and still have room. They were marked with what appeared to be claw impressions, but not arranged in any formation that matched known predators. And the tracks, according to Matthew, were leading toward higher ground, toward the ridges, toward the places where the 6 of them had planned to hike next. The tracks led not back toward the camp, but onward through the landscape. I asked Matthew, at this point, if any of the others had found their way to populated areas or ranger stations. He said he did not know. The group had separated in darkness. He had no way of knowing where the others had gone or what had become of them. The state police expanded their search radius again. This time they were looking for 5 additional bodies. The possibility of survival was no longer being considered. The search continued for 9 days. It was the largest coordinated effort the county had seen in decades. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 6 counties, and personnel from both the state police and the National Guard. Every ravine was searched. Every cave system was explored. Every accessible portion of the terrain was covered multiple times by searchers moving in overlapping grids. We found Angela Campbell's camera. We recovered several personal items scattered across 3 miles of terrain. We found evidence that someone had stopped to rest in a sheltered area, judging by the disturbed leaves and the remains of a fire that had been hastily extinguished. We found no bodies. We found no conclusive evidence of what had happened. After 9 days, the search was called off. It was officially classified as a missing persons case. The file remains open. It will almost certainly remain open for the rest of my career. I have spent 7 years attempting to research what Matthew had told us. I have read every documented account of missing persons in the Appalachian mountain system dating back to the earliest settlers. I have located references to a phenomenon in Cherokee oral tradition that translates loosely as a watcher or a thing that consumes presence. I have found fragmented accounts in 19th century journals of hikers who reported an entity that seemed to exist between categories, neither fully animal nor fully supernatural, neither entirely malevolent nor entirely indifferent. I have also found something else. 5 years after the disappearance, a hiker named David Trell was reported missing from a trail system 30 miles south of where the group had disappeared. His body was never recovered, but searchers found his supplies arranged in the same careful semicircle that Matthew had described. 3 years after that, another group of 4 hikers vanished from a location 50 miles north. Again, the camp was found intact and empty, and in each case at least one member of the search party reported finding large, unusual tracks in the mud near the water's edge. I have never told anyone, not even my wife, about what I discovered in Angela Campbell's camera. After the official search was concluded, I recovered it from evidence storage. The camera itself was broken and would not function, but there was one final image that had exposed the film before the device ceased working. The photograph was taken in near darkness. The ISO was set extremely high, attempting to gather what little light was available in the forest. The image is mostly shadow and suggestion, but there is something in the center of the frame, a shape that seems to occupy more space than the physical dimensions of the camera frame should contain, a form that suggests both absence and presence simultaneously. And in the upper corner of the image, barely visible but unmistakably present, there is a pair of eyes. They are not human. They are not the eyes of any animal in the North American fauna. They are reflecting the camera's flash in a way that suggests intelligence and intention. I have kept this photograph in a locked box for 7 years. I have never shown it to anyone. I have never attempted to have it professionally analyzed or confirmed. Some part of me does not want to know if what I am seeing is real, or if Matthew Adams has infected my perception with his own distorted recollection. Matthew Adams himself remained at the ranger station for 3 days after arriving. The state police officers attempted to charge him with filing a false report, but he cooperated fully with every interview and never wavered in his account. He admitted that his explanation was illogical and potentially impossible. He maintained that it was truthful. Eventually, they released him. He returned to his life in Charlotte. As far as I know, he has never returned to the Appalachian Mountains. I receive letters from him, infrequently but consistently. The most recent arrived 2 months ago. He has become obsessed with research into folklore and historical accounts of missing persons. He has compiled extensive documentation of unexplained disappearances throughout the mountain systems of eastern North America. He believes that what took his friends is still active. He believes that it is not limited to a specific geographic location. He has suggested that it may be expanding the range of its movements. His most recent letter contained a single sentence that I cannot get out of my mind. He wrote, "Michael, I think it found me again. It was in the parking lot outside my building on Tuesday. I did not see it clearly, but I recognized the sound. It is not finished with me. It is waiting for me to return to the mountains. It is patient, the way only things without human lifespans can be patient." I have not received a letter from Matthew in 8 weeks. His office reports that he did not return from a weekend trip. He was last seen in the parking lot of a hiking trail facility in the Smoky Mountains, approximately 80 miles from where the original group disappeared. The search is ongoing, but no bodies have been found. I am writing this account down because I need someone else to know what happened. I need someone else to understand that there are phenomena in these mountains that do not conform to scientific classification or rational explanation. I need someone to know that when they are hiking these ridges and valleys, when they are beside these still waters that seem to hold reflections of things that are not quite visible in the sky above them, there is a possibility that they are not alone. There is something here, something that existed long before the mountains were mapped and named. Something that has continued existing through centuries of human expansion and intrusion. Something that is still hunting, still consuming, still waiting for the moment when a person strays far enough from safety that the distance between them and help becomes greater than the distance they can travel before exhaustion or the impossibility of the landscape overwhelms them. I do not know if this is Fangmalia. I do not know if that name has any meaning beyond what Matthew transferred to it through trauma and fear. I only know that it is real, that it is present, and that no amount of searching or explanation or rational discourse will change the fact that 6 people walked into these mountains and only 1 walked out. And he has not yet walked out entirely. He is still walking, still running, still listening for that sound that is not quite breathing, not quite an animal cry, not quite anything that belongs in the world of human understanding. He is still walking. And sometimes, when I am alone in these mountains, when I am filing routine reports and monitoring empty trails, I wonder if I am hearing him, or if I am hearing something else. Something that has been calling through these valleys for far longer than the mountains themselves have stood against the sky. The engagement line comes too late now. It will always come too late, but I will ask it anyway, to honor those who did not return. Tell me if you have ever heard this sound. Tell me if these mountains have ever seemed to notice your presence in a way that something natural should not. Tell me if you have ever found yourself walking in a direction you did not remember choosing. Tell me if the reflections in the still water have ever looked back at you with something that you could not identify. Tell me if Fangmalia has already found you. My name is Brian Mitchell. I am 49 years old, though some days I feel much older. I work as a wilderness guide and park ranger for the Appalachian region, a position I have held for the better part of 20 years. This account is difficult to tell, but I believe it is important that someone who witnessed what happened in those caves sets down the truth, unfiltered and complete. What occurred during the summer of that year changed everything I thought I knew about the mountains I have devoted my life to protecting. The expedition began on a humid July morning. The forecast had called for clear skies and mild temperatures. We had been planning this trip for 6 months. Sharon Perez, a retired educator at 57, had organized the entire affair. She had connections to the Outdoor Recreation Committee and wanted to conduct what she called a comprehensive ecological assessment of the deeper cave systems in the Appalachian Range. She believed that documentation of these spaces would help preserve them for future generations. I respected her intentions, though I wondered if her enthusiasm sometimes outpaced her understanding of the risks involved. Michelle Turner, 41 years old, was a wildlife photographer. She had made her reputation documenting rare species in their natural habitats across 3 continents. She wanted to capture images inside the caves, particularly focusing on the unique fungal formations and any animals we might encounter. She had the technical knowledge required for underground photography, though I noted she seemed less concerned with the actual hazards of deep cave exploration than with the aesthetic possibilities of the space. Kevin Roberts was a geologist, 64 years old, with a specialty in karst topography. He had published papers on the Appalachian cave systems and was excited by the opportunity to conduct first-hand research in caves that had rarely been explored in recent decades. His academic credentials were impeccable, though I often felt his enthusiasm for the geological features sometimes made him careless about practical safety protocols. Laura Parker, 53 years old, was a physician who had insisted on joining us as our medical officer. She had outdoor experience and wanted to study the effects of prolonged underground exposure on the human body. Edward Phillips was our oldest member at 73 years old. He had caved extensively as a younger man and wanted to return to the activity one final time before his health declined further. He had been friends with Kevin for decades and trusted his expertise without question. I should have been more cautious about the composition of the group. 5 of us were in reasonably good physical condition, but Sharon was carrying extra weight, and Edward, despite his protestations to the contrary, was clearly not as capable as he had been. I voiced my concerns at our planning meeting, but Sharon assured me that the route Kevin had selected was manageable for all fitness levels. I should have insisted on a more rigorous screening process. I should have trusted my instincts. We departed from the main ranger station at 5 o'clock in the morning. The July heat had not yet descended upon the mountains, and the air was almost cool as we made our way into the foothills. Our first destination was the entrance to the Blackthorn Cave system, a series of interconnected passages that extended for nearly 2 miles into the mountain. Kevin had explored this system once before, years earlier, and believed he remembered the layout with sufficient accuracy to guide us safely through. The entrance was exactly as I remembered it from my own explorations, a gaping mouth in the limestone face, about 15 feet wide and 10 feet tall, ringed with loose rocks and wild ferns. The interior was dark as obsidian. We set up our equipment: headlamps, backup lighting systems, ropes, harnesses, first aid kits, and water supplies. Everyone checked their gear twice. Everyone confirmed their understanding of our communication protocols. We were professionals, or so I believed. The initial passage was wide and well-traveled. We could walk upright without difficulty. The limestone walls, sculpted by water over millions of years, glistened in the beams of our lights. The air smelled of mineral deposits and something else, something I could not quite identify, like earth that had never seen sunlight. The sound of our footsteps echoed strangely, creating the illusion that more people were walking with us than actually were present. After approximately 45 minutes, we reached the first junction where Kevin consulted his notes. He explained that we would be taking the left passage, which would lead deeper into the system and eventually open into a series of caverns that formed what he called the heart of the cave system. Laura suggested we take a brief rest break. Everyone accepted this suggestion gratefully. Sitting there in the cave, with our combined lights creating pools of illumination around us, I began to notice something unusual about the silence. In caves, silence is not uncommon, but this particular silence felt wrong, as though the darkness itself were listening. Edward commented on the stalactites overhead, pointing out formations that resembled faces and animals. Sharon took photographs. Michelle adjusted her camera settings. Kevin reviewed his geological notes. Laura took blood pressure readings, documenting our physical responses to the underground environment and the exertion required to reach this point. I alone seemed to notice the small black shapes that occasionally appeared in our peripheral vision, darting quickly through the darkness beyond our light sources. When I mentioned this observation to Kevin, he suggested they were likely cave crickets, an assumption that seemed reasonable but which I could not quite accept as complete truth. We resumed our descent after 20 minutes of rest. The passage became increasingly narrow, requiring us to crouch and eventually crawl through spaces barely wider than my shoulders. Kevin assured us that this restriction would be temporary, that we would soon emerge into larger chambers. Sharon moved slowly through the tight spaces, her breathing audible in my ears through the communication headset. Edward struggled more than I would have anticipated, and I found myself staying close to him, ready to assist if necessary. When we emerged from the restrictive passage, we found ourselves in a cathedral-like cavern that rose at least 40 feet above our heads. The beam of our lights could not penetrate the darkness above us. The floor beneath our feet was covered with fine silt that suggested seasonal water flow. The air temperature had dropped noticeably, and we all felt the chill as our sweat began to cool on our skin. Kevin moved toward the center of the chamber, consulting his notes again. He indicated that we had achieved approximately 1 mile of penetration into the system. The next major chamber should be another half-mile further into the mountain. Michelle began setting up her photographic equipment, her excitement palpable through her voice on the communication system. Laura checked everyone's vital signs again, taking water consumption notes and monitoring for signs of altitude sickness, though we were technically below ground level rather than above it. It was at this moment, while Kevin was explaining the geological significance of the quartz veining in the chamber walls, that we first heard the sound. It was not loud, but it was distinct and unlike anything I had expected to encounter in the deep mountain caves. It was a high-pitched chattering, almost like the rapid clicking of thousands of fingernails against stone. Kevin immediately identified it as a colony of bats. This identification should have reassured us, and it did, in the initial seconds following his explanation. Bats are common in cave systems throughout the Appalachian region. They are generally harmless, feeding exclusively on insects, attracted to caves because of the stable temperatures and shelter they provide. Yet something about this particular sound unsettled me in a way that I could not articulate. The chattering was too loud, too pervasive, and too layered to represent a small or typical bat colony. It seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, echoing off the chamber walls in ways that made it impossible to determine exactly where the creatures were located. Sharon asked Kevin what species of bat we might be encountering. He consulted his prepared materials and suggested they were likely little brown bats, a common cave-dwelling species. He explained their behaviors, their hibernation patterns, their remarkable ability to navigate in absolute darkness using echolocation. His explanation was thorough and reassuring. We should not disturb them, he advised. We should simply move through their space respectfully and continue with our expedition. But the chattering did not diminish as we moved. If anything, it grew incrementally louder and more persistent. The sound seemed to follow us through the chamber as we proceeded toward the exit passage Kevin had identified on his map. Laura commented on the sound, wondering aloud about the size of the colony that could produce such a volume of noise. Kevin suggested it might simply be acoustic effects, the way sound travels and amplifies within stone chambers. The passage leading out of that great cavern was marked on Kevin's map, though he admitted he had not traveled this particular route before. His previous expedition had accessed the system from a different entrance point, which meant we were now navigating sections of the cave system that, to my knowledge, had not been formally mapped or documented by anyone in the scientific community. This was both exciting and deeply troubling to me, though I said nothing to the others. As we began to enter the passage, I made a deliberate decision to look upward into the darkness above the cavern, shining my light toward the stone ceiling. What I saw in that moment was something I have not been able to adequately explain to anyone, though I have tried many times to find the words. The ceiling of the chamber was not stone, At least, not entirely stone. It was covered, from wall to wall, with what appeared to be a living mass. Even in the beam of my flashlight, I could not perceive the individual creatures clearly. What I perceived instead was a texture, a pattern, a writhing blanket of dark forms that covered perhaps 80% of the chamber ceiling, clustered so densely that in some places they formed what looked like draperies or folds of living tissue. The chattering sound I had been hearing was not the communication of a normal bat colony. It was the sound of millions of small, needle-like teeth working, grinding, constantly moving against each other in their excitement or agitation or hunger. I now believe they were reacting to the presence of living creatures in their space, 6 warm bodies where, in the vast majority of seasons, nothing but cold air and stone existed. When I cried out, my voice echoing through the chamber and the connecting passages, the entire mass appeared to shift and focus on our position. Thousands of eyes, each reflecting our flashlight beams with a dull red glow, turned to regard us with an attention and intelligence that I had not expected from creatures so small and so often dismissed as insignificant. This was when the screaming began. Laura was the first to scream. Later she would tell me that she had felt something strike her arm, a rapid succession of impacts like being struck repeatedly by small, hard objects. Looking at the injury afterward, I could see the marks. Hundreds of tiny punctures, far too small to be made by any normal bat species. The creatures we had seen adhered to none of the biological parameters Kevin had so confidently described before we entered those caves. Sharon began running toward what she believed was an exit passage. Kevin, attempting to maintain scientific calm, insisted that we simply needed to understand what we were experiencing, to classify and categorize it before panic could take hold of the group. His voice on the communication system remained steady, even as the sound of his accelerating footsteps suggested that his body, at least, understood the urgent necessity of departure. Michelle had stopped moving entirely. She stood in the center of the chamber, her camera still raised, apparently documenting what was happening around her with the same clinical detachment she had applied to her wildlife photography across 3 continents. I realized later that she was in shock, her mind unable to process what her eyes were perceiving as real. Edward had fallen to his knees. The exertion and terror of the moment had taxed his aging heart beyond its capacity. Laura, despite her own injuries and fear, moved immediately to his side, checking his pulse and forcing him to slow his breathing through spoken instructions. Her medical training overrode her terror temporarily, giving her a purpose that grounded her in the present moment rather than allowing her to surrender to panic. I did the only thing that occurred to me to do. I turned my flashlight away from the ceiling and toward the nearest passage, the one Kevin had indicated as our route forward. I began running toward it, shouting for the others to follow, to move immediately, to not look up. Sharon was ahead of me, her body moving with a speed and desperation that seemed impossible for a woman of her age and condition. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly across the stone walls, creating disorienting shadows and giving the impression that the cave itself was moving, that the walls were closing in from all sides. The sound was everywhere. The chattering had transformed into something louder, more aggressive. It was accompanied by the sound of wings, thousands of them, creating a noise like wind through a canyon, like the beating of 1,000 drums played in chaotic rhythm. The air filled with a sensation of movement, with small shapes passing close enough to our faces that we could feel the disturbance of air in their wake. Behind us, Laura was guiding Edward into a shambling run. Michelle had finally abandoned her camera and was following the rest of the group, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Kevin brought up the rear, still attempting to collect data, still trying to understand what was happening through the lens of established scientific knowledge, still unable to accept that what we were experiencing did not fit into any framework he possessed. I do not recall the exact layout of the passages we traversed during our flight from that chamber. Fear and adrenaline compressed time into fragments. I remember the sensation of stone scraping against my shoulders as passages narrowed. I remember the taste of minerals and fear in my mouth. I remember the constant, overwhelming awareness of movement in the darkness above us, a living ceiling that pursued us through the mountain. We passed through several larger chambers, each one triggering new panic as the echoing sound suggested that the creatures had surrounded us, that there was no escape, that the caves had become a predatory space that had somehow transformed the creatures within them into something designed specifically to hunt us. After what felt like hours but was likely only 15 or 20 minutes, Kevin identified what he believed was the passage leading back toward the original entrance. We had traveled much deeper into the system than we had intended, having unconsciously moved away from our planned route in our desperate flight from the chamber. The passage Kevin indicated sloped upward, which matched his expectation of the general direction back toward the surface world. We moved into this passage at a speed that was increasingly unsustainable. Sharon's breathing had become labored and irregular. Edward was barely moving, his mind and body separated by the extremity of his fear. Laura was supporting half his weight, her own injuries beginning to affect her mobility. The passage continued to slope upward, and the sound behind us, while still present, seemed to diminish slightly. Perhaps the creatures had ceased their pursuit. Perhaps they did not venture into the ascending passages where the air was becoming less stable, less conducive to their existence. Perhaps we had simply moved beyond the limits of their territory. But something was wrong in another way. The air had become increasingly cold, and there was a sensation of wind, as though we were moving toward a space where atmosphere was actually circulating rather than stagnating in the timeless, still darkness of the deep caves. Kevin consulted his equipment and confirmed what his instincts suggested. We had become disoriented. The passage we were following was not leading to the entrance we had used to access the system. Instead, based on the direction of the air current and the change in air pressure he was detecting, we were approaching a different exit point, one that was not on any of the maps he had prepared for this expedition. This revelation should have caused additional panic, but by this point all of us had exhausted our capacity for fear. We had moved beyond the point where terror was useful as an emotional response. We had entered into a kind of hollow calm, the emotional equivalent of shock. We simply wanted to reach the surface, to exit the caves, to emerge into the natural world where the sun existed and where predators were limited to their natural capacities and behaviors. The passage opened suddenly into a chamber that smelled of rain and fresh air. The scent was so overwhelming, so utterly different from the mineral staleness of the deep caves, that we all began to weep. Not from joy, though that was a component of what we felt. We wept from the intensity of relief that comes after surviving a situation that, at certain moments, we had been certain would result in our deaths. The chamber was illuminated by natural light, though the source was not immediately apparent. The light came from a narrow opening in the ceiling, perhaps 40 or 50 feet above our heads, a gap in the stone that opened to the late afternoon sky beyond. We stood in that chamber in absolute silence for several minutes. No one spoke, no one moved. We simply stood there, breathing air that came from the surface world, unable to process what had occurred, and equally unable to imagine returning to discuss it with anyone who had not been present. It was Michelle who finally spoke, her voice hollow and distant. She asked if anyone else had noticed what she had noticed. No one responded. She continued anyway, explaining that during our time in the deep chambers, she had turned on her camera's flash function, not to take photographs, but to better illuminate what she was seeing. In those moments when the rapid burst of light had illuminated the ceiling and the creatures clustered there, she had observed something that she could not reconcile with any species of bat she had ever encountered. The creatures were not quite right. Their proportions were wrong. Their heads were too large relative to their bodies. Their wings seemed to have too many joints, too much articulation. Their eyes, when illuminated by the flash, had not simply reflected light like animal eyes. They had appeared to analyze the light, to perceive it in the way a human might perceive a photograph, with active comprehension rather than passive reflection. Kevin had seen the same thing, and he was not offering any explanations. The authority with which he had described the bat species we had encountered had evaporated. He stood in the light-filled chamber, looking like a man who had been fundamentally altered by the experience of having his certainties destroyed. Sharon was sitting on the floor, her back against the cool stone wall. She was injured in several places where creatures had struck her. Her legs were shaking with the after effects of adrenaline. She kept repeating the same phrase. I should not have organized this. I should not have brought everyone here. I should not have been so certain that I understood the risks. Laura was tending to Edward, who had suffered what she believed was a minor heart attack during our flight through the caves. His condition was stable, but he needed to reach a hospital. She used her communication device to contact the ranger station, and through a combination of explanation and omission, she described our situation as an accident underground that had required emergency evacuation. She did not mention the creatures. Our exit from the chamber proved more challenging than our arrival. The opening above, which appeared so close and so accessible, was actually separated from us by nearly 50 feet of vertical stone face with few handholds and no established path. The equipment in our packs included climbing ropes and harnesses, though none of us had been prepared for this kind of technical climbing. particularly not in our current physical and psychological state. Kevin assembled our climbing equipment with the methodical focus of a man attempting to maintain control in a situation where all control had been lost. Michelle, despite her shock, proved surprisingly capable at rope work, having learned these skills during her wildlife photography expeditions to remote mountain regions. We established a belay system and began the slow process of climbing toward the opening above. Kevin went first, ensuring that the rope was secure and that the route was feasible. Michelle followed. Sharon went next, her exhausted body moving with agonizing slowness against the stone face. Laura guided Edward upward, staying close to him in case his condition deteriorated further. I was the last to climb. As my hands touched the stone and I began pulling myself toward the surface world, I became aware of something I had not observed clearly during our flight through the caves. The sound we had heard in the deep chambers, the chattering and the clicking of millions of small teeth, was still present, but it was different now. It was not pursuing us. Instead, it seemed to be retreating, moving deeper into the mountain, returning to the spaces from which we had temporarily disturbed it. But beneath that retreating sound, I perceived something else. A pattern in the chaos, a rhythm that almost seemed like communication, like language, as though those millions of small mouths were speaking to one another in a dialect that predated human language, that existed in frequencies and patterns that our ears had barely the capacity to perceive. I climbed faster, my hands scraping against the stone, my mind fixating entirely on the need to reach the surface, to emerge into the world where the sun existed. We emerged into the late afternoon light just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridgelines. The opening had led us to a smaller entrance than the one we had originally used, one that was located on the opposite side of the mountain and which Kevin had no record of in his research materials. We had exited the system approximately 2 miles from our vehicle. As we walked toward the parking area where we had left our transportation, all of us moving slowly and carefully, none of us speaking. I looked back only once at the entrance to the cave we had just exited. The opening seemed smaller than it should have been, given that 6 adults had just emerged from it. The stone around it was cracked and weathered in patterns that I did not recall noticing during our climb upward. And in the dying light of the late afternoon, I could have sworn I perceived a reflection from the darkness within, a flash of red that could have been a reflection, or could have been countless eyes, watching our departure. The hospital admitted Edward Phillips the same evening. The doctors confirmed that he had suffered a myocardial infarction, a heart attack brought on by the physical exertion and psychological stress of our experience in the caves. He remained hospitalized for 12 days and required the implantation of a stent in one of his coronary arteries. His full recovery took several months. Laura's injuries were extensive but not life-threatening. The creatures had struck her on both arms, her left shoulder, and her lower back. The wounds, when examined by medical staff at the hospital, proved difficult to classify. Each was a small puncture, barely larger than a needle hole, but they were consistent and numerous. The attending physician who examined her suggested they were likely caused by bats, possibly an unusually aggressive species. But even as he made this suggestion, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Bat bites do not typically present in this pattern. Bats do not typically attack with this level of coordination. Sharon's injuries were less severe than Laura's, though her psychological response to the experience was more profound. She spent 3 days in the hospital for observation, though the doctors could find nothing physically wrong with her beyond fatigue and minor contusions. When she was released, she seemed diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical damage. The energy and enthusiasm that had driven her to organize the expedition had been burned away, leaving something hollow and vacant. Michelle and Kevin were treated and released the same day. They suffered only minor injuries, cuts and abrasions from our rapid movement through the caves, nothing that required extensive medical attention. But both seemed to be experiencing psychological trauma more severe than those with more obvious physical damage. The Park Service conducted an official investigation into our expedition, prompted by Edward's need for emergency medical services and by Laura's initial incident report. I was interviewed multiple times, as was everyone else in the group. In these interviews, I was as truthful as I could be without describing the creatures we had encountered. I explained that we had encountered a large bat colony, that the colony had become agitated by our presence, and that in our attempt to escape the chamber where the colony resided, Edward had experienced a medical emergency. This account was accepted, or at least was not challenged by the investigating officers. A ranger was sent to investigate the cave system, and he returned with a report confirming that there were indeed large bat colonies present in the Blackthorn cave system. He speculated that the bats, disturbed by our presence, had responded defensively. His report closed the investigation, but Kevin had been investigating independently, and the discoveries he was making suggested something far more complex than a simple bat encounter. He had contacted me several times over the weeks following the expedition, each call bringing news that seemed more unsettling than the last. The creatures we had encountered, Kevin explained, did not match the characteristics of any bat species known to science. The size of the colony, the apparent coordination of their behavior, the physical injuries they had inflicted, and the unusual neurological characteristics Laura had documented in her notes all suggested that we had encountered something outside the normal range of biological variation. Kevin had been researching cave ecosystems and the rare animals that inhabited them. He discovered historical accounts from the 19th century, stories passed down among cave explorers and Appalachian residents, of enormous bat colonies that appeared in specific caves during particular seasons. These accounts were fragmentary and often dismissed as folklore or exaggeration, but they described incidents remarkably similar to what we had experienced. One account, dating to 1847, came from a settler named Thomas Whitley who had explored caves in the eastern mountains, seeking saltpeter for gunpowder production during a time of regional conflict. Whitley's journal, discovered in a historical archive, described a cave system where the air itself seemed alive with movement, where the darkness was populated by creatures that seemed to possess a level of coordination and intelligence that was disturbing to contemplate. Whitley's account ended abruptly, with a final entry stating only that he would not be returning to that cave system, and that some locations in the mountains existed for purposes beyond human understanding. Another account came from a cave explorer named James Hartford, writing in 1923. His published article described what he called the house bats, a colloquial term for what he believed was a single unified colony of bats that existed in several interconnected cave systems throughout the Appalachian Range. Hartford described their unusual appearance, their apparent social structure, and most troublingly, their apparent awareness of human intruders in their spaces. His article suggested that the house bats operated according to behavioral patterns and organizational principles that differed fundamentally from known bat species. Hartford had been ridiculed by the scientific community of his time, and his work was largely forgotten. Kevin showed me these accounts and others like them. The pattern was consistent across centuries. In certain caves, during certain seasons, explorers encountered what appeared to be the same enormous colony, or possibly a series of related colonies sharing behavioral characteristics and organizational structures. The creatures were described variously as bats, though bats with unusual characteristics. They seem to exist in an intermediate space between the natural and the supernatural, between known biology and something that transcended current scientific understanding. What disturbed me most about Kevin's research was not the historical accounts, strange as they were. What disturbed me was his discovery of recent accounts. Other explorers, other parties venturing into different cave systems in the Appalachian Range, had encountered similar phenomena. Some had chosen not to make their experiences public, fearing ridicule or psychiatric evaluation. Others had published their accounts on internet forums and amateur archaeology websites, where they were largely ignored or dismissed. But when you read all of these accounts together, when you examine them as a collective body of evidence rather than as isolated incidents, a pattern emerged that was impossible to dismiss. The house bats, whatever they actually were present across a wide geographic range. They seemed to exhibit a level of intelligence and awareness that went beyond normal animal behavior, and they appeared to be increasing in number and expanding their territory, entering cave systems where they had not been recorded previously. One evening, about a month after the expedition, Kevin called me with news that turned the entire nature of our experience into something I am still struggling to process. He had been working with a researcher at the university who specialized in bat biology. He had shown this researcher photographs of the creature's injuries on Laura's body, and while the researcher had confirmed that they were consistent with bat bites, she had also noted something unusual. The penetration pattern of the bites, the precise spacing and depth, suggested a coordinated attack. Not a simple defensive response to perceived threat, but a deliberate action. More disturbing still, the researcher had identified traces of an unknown substance in Laura's wounds, something that had been injected along with the bite. Something that did not match any known bat venom or saliva composition. The substance was not poisonous, and it was not infectious. Its purpose was unclear. The researcher theorized that it might be a chemical marker, something the creatures use to identify other members of their colony or to mark territory or prey. But this theory raised far more questions than it answered. If the creatures were intelligent enough to employ chemical markers in a coordinated fashion, what did that say about their actual nature? Were they animals, or were they something else, something that had evolved or been shaped to exist in an intermediate space between animal and something beyond our current capacity to classify? I received a letter from Michelle approximately 2 months after the expedition. She had withdrawn from her professional obligations and was living quietly in a rural area far from any caves. She wrote that she could not stop thinking about the photographs she had taken in the moments before her rational mind had shut down and she had fled. She had examined these photographs multiple times, zooming in on details, trying to see clearly what her eyes had perceived only in fragments during our time in that chamber. What she had seen, or believed she had seen, was an organization to the creature's arrangement on the ceiling that was too precise to be random. They seemed to be arranged in patterns, in formations that suggested purpose and planning. In one photograph, the formation seemed to trace out shapes that, if viewed with a certain perspective, resembled symbols or writing in a language that predated human civilization. Michelle wrote that she was no longer capable of viewing animals as simple creatures driven only by instinct and biological imperative. She had seen too much. She had encountered something that had fundamentally altered her understanding of consciousness and intelligence and the hidden layers of meaning that might exist in the natural world around us. Sharon declined my invitation to meet and discuss the incident several months after the expedition. She wrote that she did not wish to discuss the caves or the expedition any further. She was working with a therapist to process her experience, but she found that each conversation about that day reopened wounds she was trying to heal. She did not blame me or anyone else in the group. She accepted responsibility for her role in organizing the expedition, but she asked that I respect her desire to move forward without further examination of what had occurred. Edward recovered physically, though he remained hospitalized for cardiac monitoring for an extended period. When I visited him in the hospital, he seemed almost grateful for the heart attack. It had given him permission to live a quieter life, to avoid the caves and forests he had once loved, to retreat into domestic spaces where the only movements around him were the predictable behaviors of human society. When he was discharged, he asked me never to contact him about the expedition again. Laura and I maintained contact, though our conversations about the incident became increasingly vague over time. She had documented everything about the experience in her medical notes, and she seemed content to let the scientific record speak for itself. Her theories about what had happened evolved over time. She eventually came to believe that what we had encountered was not anything inherently supernatural, but simply an aspect of the natural world that had not been adequately studied or understood. The scientific establishment, she theorized, was resistant to acknowledging gaps in its knowledge, preferring to ignore or dismiss evidence that contradicted established frameworks. She recommended that I move forward with my life, that I not allow this single incident to define my relationship with the mountains I had devoted my life to serving as a ranger. The mountains, she assured me, were still fundamentally safe. What had occurred in that cave was an anomaly, an unusual encounter with an unusual animal or colony of animals. It was not representative of the mountains in general. I have tried to take her advice. I continue to work as a park ranger. I lead guided nature walks and camping expeditions. I maintain my equipment and my knowledge of wilderness survival and emergency protocols. I present myself as competent and reliable to the tourists and outdoor enthusiasts who seek my services. But I have not returned to the deeper cave systems. I have filed requests to have certain areas of the Appalachian caves designated as restricted zones, areas off limits to civilian exploration. These requests have been denied. The caves, park officials have explained, are protected natural resources that should be available to the public for educational and recreational purposes. Restricting access would require evidence of genuine danger, not merely the concerns of a single ranger based on an unusual but ultimately explainable incident. The only thing that has changed about my life in the aftermath of this experience is that I now know something that I cannot unknow. I know that the mountains contain spaces that are not fully explored or understood. I know that intelligence and organization can exist in forms that are radically different from what we expect or anticipate. And I know that humanity's dominion over the natural world is not absolute. I began this account by explaining that I am a park ranger who has devoted 20 years to protecting the mountains and the people who visit them. That remains true. But I am also now a man who has looked into a darkness that seemed to look back, who has sensed consciousness and purpose in a place where science had taught me to expect only mindless biological drives. I am a man who knows that the caves still exist, that the creatures still dwell in those deep places, and that every year more people venture into those mountains, seeking adventure and experience and connection with nature. I wonder how many of them will encounter what we encountered. I wonder how many will emerge with the same knowledge, the same awareness that there is something in those caves that defies easy explanation or dismissal. I wonder if, over time, more accounts will accumulate, more patterns will emerge, more people will begin to understand what the caves are actually protecting in their depths. But mostly I listen to the sounds of the mountains around me. The wind through the trees, the calls of birds, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. And beneath all of these natural sounds, I listen for something else. For the faint echo of a sound I heard in the darkness, a chattering that never quite fades, that seems to exist just at the edge of perception, a reminder that there are places in this world where human understanding has no authority, where the natural world operates according to its own rules and purposes. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what I have chosen to document while I am still here to tell it. Whether anyone believes it, whether anyone even reads these words, I cannot control. I can only offer the truth as I experienced it, and hope that someday someone will be brave enough or foolish enough to investigate whether the house bats, the creatures that inhabit the deep places of the Appalachian Mountains, are as impossible as they seem, or simply as unknown as they have remained.